Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and this is episode 120, The Beloved. We're well into season 6 now, and we've entitled this season, The Object of Our Formation. But the point of discipleship is to become more like Jesus. If that is the primary reason we've been rescued, what exactly does that mean? Are our ideas of Jesus, our assumptions about him, the same as Jesus, the actual person? How well do we know the object of our formation so that we have a clear vision of who we're supposed to become more like? Well, we started this season by laying some groundwork, talking about how important it is that our ideas, these often unconscious assumptions that power and govern us, of things like love and goodness, match with God's ideas. So we've defined love like this: seeking someone's goodness according to God's ideas. And in the last few episodes, we've been exploring our first characteristic of Jesus, his relational security. Very interesting. Jesus was and is the most emotionally and relationally secure person in human history. If we have the opportunity to become more like him, then arguably we should find ourselves becoming more relationally secure. So today we're going to continue to explore this characteristic of relational security and what it means in our 4 relationships with God, with others, with ourselves, and also with creation and culture. Can we truly become more relationally secure like Jesus? Let's dive in. Raymond Carver is best known as a short story writer, someone who played a major role in reviving the American short story form in the 1980s. But he was also a very talented poet. The final poem in his last published work is called Late Fragment, and it was written while he was dying of cancer. And the whole poem is short, but goes like this. And did you get what you wanted from this life even so? I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. As we discuss Jesus' remarkable relational security, we're talking about what it means to live in the reality of being beloved. It's a two-way relationship between us and God the Father, in which we embrace our connection to him and our place in his family. But as doctrinally correct and intellectually appealing as this might be, this truth may not have settled all the way into our hearts. Some truths can't just be taught, they must be experienced. We've been exploring this sort of reality of being human for a few years now here at Soil and Roots. And as Peggy Reynoso writes, when the intellect engages with a fact, the fact is stored as truth and belief results. In contrast, the heart believes only what it experiences. We're created to establish belief through 2 pathways, cognitive and experiential. Only when both pathways are engaged does belief become complete. Well, let's start with what it means to experience relational security with God, our Father. We are, after all, his adopted sons and daughters. Adoption is a beautiful relationship between human beings, but even so, it takes time and experience for the heart to sort of catch up. Adopted children go through an adjustment period as a transition to their new life with their new family. My wife is adopted. She talks about that all the time. They have to learn about expectations and routines and whole new people. This adjustment period can take weeks or months or perhaps even years. According to Focus on the Family, it's important for the adopting parents to be with their new child as much as possible, especially for the first few months. For an adopted daughter, for example, they write, "These next 3 months will provide you with the best opportunities you'll ever have for helping her develop the foundation for a secure and healthy attachment. Developmentally, this is when she will learn trust, self-worth, and self-efficacy." I think this is a bit like our adjustment period when we've been adopted into God's family. The transition can feel abrupt, especially in a modern church culture that puts far more emphasis on getting saved or converted or praying the sinner's prayer rather than on discipleship and this lifelong journey of apprenticing with Jesus, what we call spiritual formation. Now, God does accomplish miraculous transformations in us, but usually not all at the same time and not all at once. The heart often takes time and experience as it learns to accept and embrace this new reality. So let's look back at what we just reported on the adopted child, what they need in that adjustment period, and apply it here. She learns to trust in the reality that my God will meet my needs. She learns self-worth. That is, God meets my needs, so I must be valuable to God. Her heart embraces self-efficacy, which is my cries matter to God because he hears me and he responds when I cry. These are not intellectual assertions. These are experienced realities along the lines of what we here at Soil and Roots call ideas. Again, our intellects understand the facts, but our hearts also need to experience those realities in order for our belief to be complete. So when the heart doesn't fully experience the resolution of these questions, it will continue in this adjustment period and struggle to fully inhabit the reality of being adopted, of being the beloved. Well, what does that look like? What does it mean if we're sort of stuck in the adjustment period? Well, we see it all the time, and frankly, we probably experience it ourselves with some regularity. People who profess to follow Jesus and intellectually know they are part of God's family, they can say the proper Bible verses, but they act in ways that actually don't align with those beliefs. People whose hearts, if they were being honest, would say, I don't really trust God to meet my daily needs because I'm not sure I'm valuable to him. I fear he doesn't hear me and he won't respond to me when I cry out to him. That's the honest assessment of their heart versus their intellectual belief system. I suspect we can all relate to that in some way. So this sometimes manifests as fear or anxiety, loneliness, depression, anger, and a host of other difficult emotions that are felt by people all around the world. Because despite being adopted into a worldwide huge family, sometimes our hearts have yet to experience the fullness of that reality, usually because of something in our histories, in our stories. Okay, so we're now drifting into what it means to experience security with ourselves. Well, Jesus is the most relationally and emotionally secure person who's ever lived. So even while on earth, he fully embodied his authentic, good identity. He had no false self or shadow self, some of these terms that we use to describe us when we're sort of faking it. He is intimately close to his Father, loving to his spiritual siblings, and confident in his authority and in the rights that brings. He's content and satisfied with his relationship with not only God, but also with himself. So that's what it looks like when somebody is relationally secure with both the Father and themselves. Well, for many of us, our default is to exist in a state of anxiety or stress. Maybe it's quiet, maybe it's hidden, but it's still there. And then every so often, we experience real serenity and peace. We might have a mountaintop experience or a meaningful time of worship and have a sense of completely trusting and resting in God. But our standard, our norm, is usually something different than that. Those times of incredible security and unity with God stand out because they tend to be rare. And even acknowledging that may cause us, a small amount of shame. But what if they were the rule, not the exception? What would it look like for the truth of being beloved to be embodied in us, where we walked in that reality day in and day out? And so times of anxiety or doubt still came upon us, but they were more the exception and not the rule. And it would mean waking up, resting in the confidence that whatever the day brings, it is caused or permitted by God, and we feel safe in that. We exist in a realm of safety, even though we have very little control over those circumstances. Maybe we've discovered Paul's secret as well, and we have learned to be content in all circumstances, not just as an intellectual exercise, but we actually feel we embody that contentment most of the time. We wake up in this way because we live in the reality that God is good and that we are his beloved. We relate to ourselves in a healthy, wise manner because we experience that security in the Father. Relational security with God would be our automatic state. so we would be at peace even when things around us aren't quite peaceful. Well, how in the world do we get there? Well, there's numerous answers to that question, but just one idea is the telling and retelling of our stories in a safe, secure environment. We learn ourselves, we learn how our stories are being redeemed by Christ. As we relay our stories in trusted friendships, our hearts learn to embrace the truth about our histories, both memories and moments of joy and of sorrow. The heart then experiences this sense of withness that we've talked about before, and acceptance of those who take the time to listen to us, even if we tell the story repeatedly. That's just one step. Just taking this one step often helps us develop a deeper security in our relationship with God and with ourselves, and so that trickles down to our relationships with others. All right, well, let's chat about that. Let's explore what does it mean to be relationally secure in our relationships with other people. Well, to be secure in our relationship with others, we must first be secure in our relationship with God and ourselves. Jesus' actions flowed from his relationship with his Father, not from hopes or fears about other people's choices or their perspectives of him or other people. Jesus was not going to be a different person if the rich young ruler had decided to sell everything and follow him. He was going to be the same regardless. And our relationships work the same way. So think about two young couples about to be married. One, bride and groom, have a firm sense of their own identity as individuals, separate from each other. They know who they are in Christ, they are relationally secure. The other bride and groom are still, quote unquote, finding themselves, and they hope that their new spouse will help them to do that. They think their new spouse will complete them, a la Jerry Maguire, and their identity is actually dependent on being valued by this other person. Well, heading into their marriages, which couple do you think is more prepared to stand the test of time? My guess would be the first couple, the two that are already secure in their own identities. Relational security, to some extent, means that we don't rely on another person to tell us who we are. We may invite them into a relationship, but if they don't like us or they treat us poorly, it doesn't really impact our sense of security. We can handle relational challenges with others because we are tied so securely to Jesus first. Back in episode 116, I quoted Lisa Turkhurst about the distinction between showing sacrificial love and allowing somebody to harm you. Turkhurst argues that healthy boundaries are actually God-honoring. We please him when we insist on relationships that honor love the way he created and intended it. Sometimes seeking someone's goodness means establishing boundaries or even discontinuing a relationship with them. I've had to make those decisions a few times in my life. Sometimes the best way to love someone is stick it out through thick and thin, and sometimes it's best to walk away quietly. This understanding of boundaries may sometimes buck up against our ideas of what it means to be Christian, to follow Jesus. Back in Isaiah, Jesus is portrayed as the lamb led to slaughter, the sheep that didn't open his mouth. Combined with other verses, this can suggest to some that it's downright unchristian to even protect yourself, or to stop giving, or to say enough is enough in a relationship. In 2023, artist Phil Wickham released a song called The Jesus Way, and one of the verses goes like this: "If you curse me, then I will bless you. If you hurt me, I will forgive. And if you hate me, then I will love you. I choose the Jesus way. If you strike me, I will embrace you. And if you chain me, I'll sing his praise. And if you kill me, my home is heaven, for I choose the Jesus way." Blessing those who curse us and forgiving those who hurt us are undoubtedly very good responses. However, an attitude that we can be hurt or hated or struck or harmed and that our only response is to love, forgive, and embrace immediately can lead to a kind of doormat faith that leads us to think it's okay to be abused at random. And that's simply not God-honoring, because that's not how he intended our relationships to work. Yes, Jesus went to the cross, though he didn't permit people to kill him before it was time, and he essentially orchestrated the events that led to his own death. He never gave up his agency. Was he silent as a sheep before its shearer all the time? Well, he called people hypocrites and blind guides, blind fools, and snakes, a brood of vipers full of greed and self-indulgence and whitewashed tombs. Those are not exactly things that a doormat would say, particularly in public. At the time and place of his choosing, Jesus allowed himself to be captured and beaten and crucified. But there were other times when his enemies wanted to kill him, and he flat out just refused to let it happen. He stopped them, he just walked away. We can also act for the good of others without feeling obligated to let them harm us. We can insist on a God-honoring way of relating because it reflects principles of genuine love and goodness. We should relate to others with compassion and kindness and patience and long-suffering, but we can also be wise and careful, even shrewd and guarded where appropriate. That's relational wisdom, and it's embedded in this idea of relational security, and we see it in Jesus in the gospel in spades. To be secure in our relationships with others, we also listen to them. This is one of the primary characteristics of a deep disciple. We take the time to be truly present. We give our attention and genuine interest. We seek to see others, to know them, to understand them, to hear their stories, as we long to have somebody that wants to listen to and understand our stories. This involves being vulnerable, which is why it's so vital to have appropriate boundaries and safe, healthy relationships with those to whom we give access to our hearts. We treat people as individuals, and we respond to them individually. This is the deep disciple trait of particularity that we've explored before, and which Jesus was a master of. We see people as unique and worthy of being interacted with in a unique, individualized way. We give generously because we know God will provide for our needs. We respond compassionately because we know God has compassion for us. We show patience and forgiveness because we know God is patient and forgiving towards us. In short, we seek the goodness of others as God has defined it, which will look different depending on the person and the circumstances. We don't feel obligated to relate to each person the same way, and that in and of itself is somewhat freeing. What about being secure in our relationship with creation and culture? It sounds a little weird. Well, to begin with, being secure means we act in a manner appropriate to the roles that we've been given. We are sons and daughters of the King. We are royalty with great power and authority. We're stewards, invited to cultivate and tend and care for the physical earth. We are salt and light, bringing life and flavor and flourishing to a world in the grips of darkness and decay. As I said before, we live in a culture that values knowledge and intellectualism. We want information before we proceed and believe that there's only one answer to every question. As children of the Enlightenment, we know 2 plus 2 is always 4, and we look for a prescription to address any problem, a specific answer that we can directly apply. So we can be tempted to read the scriptures prescriptively as well. Dallas Willard, in his book, The Scandal of the Kingdom, cautions against this kind of perspective. Quote, Jesus' teaching about life in the kingdom is the indispensable means for our coming to be able to live in the kingdom day by day, moment by moment, comfortably in the care of God and in obedience and service to Him. We shut this down when we turn his teaching into legalism. If we don't understand how he taught, legalism will run rampant because we will interpret what he was saying as laws. Willard notes that this is a common mistake when looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. This mistake leads to people thinking that they always have to give anyone who asks them. If someone takes their shirt, they have to give them their coat. And if anyone makes them go 1 mile, they have to go 2. But taking this teaching as a prescriptive command for all situations can be unrealistic or dangerous or even in violation of other principles of love that God describes in other places. Willard continues, sometimes the behaviors Jesus used in his teaching are misinterpreted as commands when they were only intended as examples to reverse a prevailing assumption. For example, when he said, give to everyone who asks of you and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you, he was not stating a general command for every situation, but many people have interpreted that way. In this case, the prevailing cultural assumption was that success meant being powerful and wealthy and that it was wise to hoard one's wealth and only to give when one was legally obligated. The prevailing assumption was that wealth could save and it was okay to ignore the needs of the less fortunate, particularly if they didn't share your religion or your ethnicity or your nationality. Well, Jesus comes along with a principle of kingdom living that turns this assumption on its head. In his upside-down kingdom, wealth does not save. In fact, it can make it harder to get into the kingdom. In his kingdom, it's better to give than receive, and his kingdom is marked by kindness and generosity and trust. That was shocking to his original audience, just as it flies in the face of some cultural assumptions today. But we wade into dangerous waters when we take what Jesus intended as an example to reverse a prevailing assumption and apply it as a definitive instruction for every single situation. Instead, as Willard points out, we should ask, what is the principle Jesus wants us to learn? What prevailing assumption is he reversing? What is he illustrating about kingdom life in general? And how might it help us in our relationship with creation and culture? But when we engage with culture, whether at an individual or an institutional level, we do need to wrestle with whether or not we are more focused on being right or being in a right relationship. When Jesus gave the Great Commission, it was in the context of making disciples through the close, long-term, intimate relationships required for true spiritual formation and learning all that Jesus commanded in order to help others to be adopted into his family and then to help their hearts adjust to that new reality. All this revolves around relationship. Sometimes, when we insist on being right, it can exact a high price. If we're more focused on being right than on being in a right relationship, it can also slam doors in people's faces. It can close off potential friendships. It can harden hearts that might have been soft or that might become soft down the road. Peter writes that we are to, quote, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and reverence. It's this gentleness and reverence or respect that can fall by the wayside if our primary goal is always simply to be right. In an interview about his book, Renovation of the Heart, Willard said, what we need to push as Christians is to say, look, we're not here to prove we're right. We're here to help people. Elsewhere, he stated, one of the hardest things in the world is to be right and not hurt other people with it. Our approach to sharing our spiritual story can be just as important as the story itself. The meat of our message will not mean much if we destroy our relationships with the people who need to receive it. It will not matter how right we are or how right we prove ourselves if we're the only ones left in the room. Well, how can we know when it's time to draw a line in the sand and stand firm right now, and when it's time to focus on building relationships and setting an example for others to follow, and maybe having more difficult conversations down the road? Well, asking the question is a good start. Finding deep disciples, stage 5 and 6 Christians maybe, to emulate and ask for advice is helpful. Forming a community of fellow Jesus apprentices, that can also help be a guide for us. And obviously we can pray and ask Jesus to direct us and then be sensitive to his leading. But understanding that sometimes what Jesus invites us to do or not do in any given situation may not be anything like what we were originally thinking. Well, can we truly become more relationally secure in our relationships with God, others, ourselves, and creation and culture? Absolutely. In fact, I think we should expect it. It starts with experiencing being the beloved in God's family and then allowing that security, that experience, that reality to flow out of us to other relationships and to creation and culture. This is how we express goodness to those around us. Those who accept God's invitation to experience being beloved often become world changers in the little kingdoms that God has allowed us each to steward. Thanks so much for being with me today. You can find us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram at Soil and Roots Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube and Substack at simply Soil and Roots. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, the organization, the nonprofit, just head on over to soilandroots.org. If you'd like to financially support our work, you can do so safely and securely on the website. If you'd like to reach out to us via email, you can do so at fish@soilandroots.org. Today's episode was written by the master, Dr. Tim Boswell. I edited it, and Zach Fisher produced it. He also provided the music and the cool beats for today's show, so you can check him out on Spotify at FishU. Thanks again for being with me, and we'll see you next time.